Chapter 3 of The Master Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Master Mystery by John W. Gray and Arthur B. Reeve. Chapter 3. Brent had no intention of keeping the promise which Balcom had extracted from him by a species of moral duress that afternoon. In fact, already he had gone too far in his plans for restitution, or was it self-preservation, to turn back. It was late in the night that he himself secretly admitted to the house a tall, dark-haired stranger who evidently called by appointment. "Well, Flint," he greeted in a hushed tone, "what was it you asked to see me about?" Flint replied not a word, but impressively tapped a bundle which he carried under his arm and began to undo the cord which bound it. Brent looked startled, then caught himself. He had known Flint for some time, an adventurer more or less unscrupulous, who had been the foreign representative of International Patents. Flint took off his coat and threw it on a chair with an air of assurance that seemed to increase Brent's anxiety, then began again to untie the bulky package. "Just a moment, Flint," cautioned Brent, stopping him. With an air of uneasy secrecy, Brent hurried to the door that led from the dining room to the conservatory and bolted it securely. Then he made sure that the door to the library was bolted. As he did so, he did not see his secretary, Zita, watching in the hall, for the footsteps of Locke, approaching, had caught her quick ear and she had fled. "Locke," called Brent, hearing his laboratory manager, "under no circumstances allow me to be disturbed tonight." "Very well, sir," responded Locke. Just then the light step of Eva was heard on the stairs. "What's the matter, Father?" she asked, still upset by the events of the afternoon. "Is there anything wrong?" "No, my dear, nothing," hastily replied Brent. "In the morning I shall have something to say to you. Now run along like a good girl." Dutifully Eva turned. Brent watched her out of sight. Then, with a keen look at Locke, he pulled out a paper from his pocket and handed it to the young scientist, who read: "Brent, this is my last warning. If you persist in your course, you will be struck down by the Madagascar madness. Q." Locke looked up from the scrawl in alarmed perplexity. "What does this mean?" he queried. Brent merely shook his head cryptically. "Study this message. I shall have something very important to tell you in the morning." As Brent turned back into the library he paused a moment and looked after Locke, hesitating, as if he would call him back. Then he decided not to do so, turned, and carefully locked the door from the dining room into the hallway. Eva was waiting at the head of the stairs as Locke, perplexed by the strange actions of his employer, came up. "What is the trouble?" she repeated anxiously. "Please tell me. Is there anything wrong?" "No, nothing," reassured Locke, in spite of his own doubt. "Everything is all right." "I hope so." Eva lingered. "Good night." Locke bowed admiringly. But there was the same restraint in his look that had been shown in the afternoon. "Good night," he murmured slowly. Eva quite understood, and there was a smile of encouragement on her face as she turned away and flitted down the hall to her room. Outside, Zita had hurried from the house to the nearest public telephone booth and was frantically calling Balcom at his apartment. "Mr. Balcom," she repeated breathlessly as the junior partner answered. "Flint has returned. I have seen him." "The devil!" exclaimed Balcom, angrily, then checked himself before he said any more. "Keep me informed." Abruptly he hung up. It was scarcely a moment later that Paul Balcom entered the Balcom apartment, admitted by a turbaned black suggestive of the Orient. Paul was surly and had evidently been drinking, for he shoved the servant roughly out of the way as he strode toward his father. Apparently, outside, Paul had overheard and had gathered the drift of what Balcom had been saying. Or perhaps, from his own sources of information, he already knew. At any rate, as Balcom turned from the telephone, father and son faced each other angrily. "Brent's lying," exclaimed Paul. "That marriage to me must take place tomorrow." Talking angrily, sometimes in agreement, at others far apart, the two left the room. Back in the dining room by this time Brent had rejoined Flint and now watched him eagerly as he took the last wrappings from the package which he had carried so carefully. As the last wrapping was stripped from it, on the table before them lay a small steel model, perhaps 3 feet high, a weird-looking thing in the miniature shape of a man, designed along lines that only a cubist could have conceived, jointed, mobile, truly a contrivance at which to marvel. Brent gazed incredulously at the strange thing. "An automaton!" he exclaimed. "More than that," replied Flint, calmly. Flint unrolled a chart of the human nervous system and spread it out on the table. Pointing to the brain, he leaned over tensely and whispered, "This model is merely a piece of mechanism, but the real automaton possesses a human brain which has been transplanted into it and made to guide it." For a moment Brent listened incredulously, then sat back in his chair and laughed skeptically. But even Flint recognized that there was a hollowness in the laughter. "Do you mean to tell me," demanded Brent, "that a human brain has been made to control a thing of no use except as a terrible engine of destruction?" "Not only possible," reiterated Flint, "but it is true." "Oh, Flint," rallied Brent with a sort of uneasiness, "you can't tell me that." "Believe it or not," insisted the adventurer, "I have been in Madagascar, and I know." For a moment Brent paused at the vehemence of Flint's answer. What had Flint to gain by misrepresentation? 1,000 images of the past flitted through Brent's brain. Then, slowly, a look of terror came over Brent's face. Suppose it were indeed true, this Frankenstein, this conscienceless, inhuman Superman? Brent gripped himself and composed his features and his voice. "But this thing," he rasped, "what does this prove?" "Oh, this is merely automatic, a piece of mechanism, a model which I stole. It works when it is wound up, not like the real one. Look." Flint put a pencil in the little steel hand of the model and pressed a lever as he held a piece of paper under the pencil. Brent leaned over, fascinated. Instantly the tiny hand began to trace on the paper one letter, the simple letter Q. As the hand finished the tail of the Q, Brent gripped the table for support. His eyes bulged and stared wildly. "My God!" burst from his lips. "It is the warning Q." For minutes Brent strove to regain his composure. Nor was Flint less impressed than the man before him. What would have been the emotions of both if they had been able to penetrate with the eye through the rocky cliffs on which the stately mansion of Brent Rock stood would have been hard to say. For down in a rock-hewn cavern, not many 100 yards away and below them, reached by a secret entrance from the shrubbery of the cliffs near the shore, already had congregated several rough characters. They were playing cards and drinking, now and then glancing furtively at the passage entrance as though they were expecting the arrival of someone or something. Suddenly came a dull metallic clank through the passage, strangely echoing. At once all leaped to their feet, at attention, not unmixed with awe and fear that sat strangely on their desperate features. What was it that they, who feared neither God nor man, feared? They strained their eyes, looking into the passage that led darkly away into blackness. Dimly down it now could be seen two gleaming spots of light, points in the Cimmerian darkness. They seemed to be growing larger and coming nearer as with each hollow reverberation the dull metallic thuds increased. Faintly now could be made out in the blackness a huge stalking figure, having the shape of a man, with gigantic, powerful shoulders, powerful arms, a thick body, hips and thighs that spelled terrific strength, legs and feet that suggested irresistible force. "The Automaton!" escaped involuntarily from all lips. Slowly, irresistibly, the horrendous figure stalked forth into the dim light. There it paused for a moment, a figure of steel, larger than most men, yet not so large that it might have encased a man. And yet its motions, its every action, were like nothing mortal. Even these hardened denizens of the underworld shuddered. In its hand the Automaton carried a 5-branched candlestick, for what purpose none seemed to know. Yet all bowed and quaked at every pantomime motion of the figure, ready to do the bidding of the least motion of their inhuman master. Still holding the candlestick with its 5 huge yellow candles before him, the Automaton stalked forward to the table and impressively deposited the candlestick on it, then stepped back a pace and waved his ponderous hand at the assembled emissaries, who scarcely repressed their own abject terror. End of chapter 3. Recording by Roger Moline.